Hi there, Damien Carrick with you. Welcome to the Law Report. On our last program, we focused on the privacy and safety issues around the rapid rise in the number of drones here in Australia. On this program, we look at how the military and police, as well as terror groups and criminals, currently use drones, and how drones might be used in the future, for good or for bad.
If you have been watching the Super Bowl with Lady Gaga in the US this year, you've already seen dozens of drones with lights creating quite an interesting visual effect. However, same technology can be used to control dozens of drones at the same time with explosives or anthrax or other materials on them, creating havoc.
Almost every second day there are media reports of targeted drone strikes by US forces in the Middle East. The coverage focuses on who is killed. Are they legitimate targets or are they innocent bystanders, civilians? Last week, the UK Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee released a report into the drone killing of Riyadh Khan back in August 2015. Sarah Smythe, Associate Professor at La Trobe University Law School, is the author of Drone Controversies, Ethical and Legal Debates Surrounding Targeted Strikes and Electronic Surveillance. The book was recently published by Thomson Reuters.
Riyadh Khan was a 20-year-old British citizen who was from Cardiff, and he had become radicalized. He went to Syria to become a jihadist, and then he tried to recruit others on the internet using social media tools. And
I understand he often sort of posted really bloody IS videos on social media, and he boasted of killing prisoners, and he also posted images of corpses online. So a pretty reprehensible character.
Yes, and in fact the UK government maintains that Khan orchestrated numerous plots to murder large numbers of UK civilians as well as those of the UK's allies.
When and how did he die?
He was actually killed by a drone strike. It was a precision strike that was taken in Raqqa on the 21st of August in 2015, and the strike was against a vehicle in which Mr. Khan and 3 other ISIL fighters were traveling at the time.
And this was actually a first. This attack was unprecedented because it was the first time there was such an attack on a British terrorist target by British forces outside of military operations, outside of a war zone.
Correct. And in fact, the questions have been raised around whether the strike can be legally justified. Surveillance and data analysis had linked Khan to patterns of activity and behavior that corresponded to a set of indicators for militant activity. But the broader question is whether the strike can be justified by the UK as an act of self-defence in armed conflict.
So last week, the UK Parliament's Intelligence Committee released a report on Riyadh Khan's death, and they said, look, we don't have enough information to decide whether or not the attack was necessary and proportionate, but they expressed profound disappointment with the lack of information given to them by government about whether or not he posed, or satisfied their questions about whether or not he posed an imminent threat and whether the attack was therefore proportionate. Acknowledging he was a threat, they said, quote, there is nevertheless a question as to how the threat was quantified, and in this instance whether the actions of Khan amounted to an armed attack against the UK or Iraq. Well, what's your response to that assessment and to those conclusions of that parliamentary inquiry?
Well, both the US and the UK have argued that they are exercising a collective right of self-defense on behalf of Iraq. And the basis of this is because Iraq has the right to self-defense against ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. It also has the right to ask its allies for collective self-defense in both countries. The US and the UK as well have been maintaining for quite some time that they are facing a ruthless sub-state adversary that has no allegiance to any particular country, that abides by no laws, and that poses an imminent threat to world peace and security. And the fact is as well that terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS most often don't wear uniforms, they don't carry arms openly or abide by the conventional laws of war. So instead, they terrorize and kill civilian populations by bombing buildings and airplanes, kidnapping and murdering journalists, and so on. So Both the US and the UK have maintained that secrecy is necessary around these strikes, so we don't have a lot of information around them. They're part of highly classified information and operations. But at the same time, they are arguing that they're exercising their collective right of self-defense on behalf of Iraq.
This case involved a drone killing by UK forces, but of course most drone strikes are by the US forces. Do we know how many thousands of strikes have there been over, let's say, the last 10 years by US forces?
Well, historically, of course, drones were used to collect intelligence. However, during the last 15 years or so, particularly since the tragic 9/11 attacks, they've been used to strike at the heart of the enemy in the global war on terror in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and now in Syria. And they're being used generally to target those who are deemed to be affiliated with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and Al-Shabaab. And during the last 15 years or so, we've seen thousands of people, both suspected terrorists and innocent civilians, killed in this ongoing conflict.
But we don't have any firm figures about the number of people killed and how many of them are civilians, innocent bystanders.
The US government has recently released figures around the number of civilian casualties that have occurred over the last 15 years or so. However, it's very difficult to get at the heart of those statistics, particularly given that they conflict with the reports that we've seen coming out of other human rights organizations and news organizations that would suggest that the number of civilian casualties are actually much higher than the US government has disclosed.
According to the London-based Bureau of Investigative Journalism, more than 7,000 people have been killed by drones during the Obama presidency. Of those, it suggests 900 were civilians and as many as 110 were children. That's one list, but are they a reputable organisation, do we know?
Yes, I would say that they are.
There were reports last week that a US drone killed 3 or 4 Al-Qaeda operatives in Yemen, and according to Reuters, the drone also killed 3 civilians. The 3 operatives were travelling in a car when the drone attacked. 3 civilians just happened to be passing by when they died. These sorts of instances are totally common, aren't they?
Yes, and past experience in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular tells us that the scale and frequency of civilian deaths are perhaps disproportionate to the military advantage that drone strikes offer. Not only can we point to the high number of civilian casualties, those who happen to be present or near someone who is targeted as a terrorist when the drone strike occurs. But they've also been increasing opposition within civilian populations and thereby deepening and prolonging the conflict.
And turning the population against the US.
Absolutely. In fact, the killing of civilians in drone strikes has become a major inspiration for ISIS and other terrorist groups. And in fact, it's been said to be the most important driving force for terrorism around the world.
And then on the back of that, you also have from back in February, I think one of the major figures in Al-Qaeda was killed in Afghanistan. And that was talked about as being a very major victory against Al-Qaeda.
Yes, and there's no question that the drone strikes have been effective in disabling and disbanding terrorist groups like the Taliban and like Al-Qaeda. At the same time, though, there are questions as to whether the strikes are necessary and proportional and appropriate, and whether the civilian deaths are disproportionate to the military advantage that drone strikes offer.
It was interesting to read that following last week's Israeli strike on weapons stored near Damascus airport, there were reports of a drone coming from Syrian territory crossing into Israel before it was knocked out of the sky. Now, it's pretty unclear where that drone came from, but it's quite likely it was a non-state actor like Hezbollah. So drones are now being used, I guess, on both sides of the conflict. Can we put it that way?
Absolutely. And it's true that drones have fallen into the hands of Hezbollah, and they have actually been used by Hezbollah.
These are incredibly complicated issues. Do you have a kind of a view about when they should and they shouldn't be used? To kill people, to assassinate people?
Yes. As a military weapon, they can only be used in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. And essentially that means that the use of force can only be exercised lawfully under international law. It's not to be used against civilian populations, and states are required to minimize collateral damage and unintended injury. As well, states need to maintain certain requirements and meet certain requirements to use force lawfully in self-defense. And to be justified, that needs to be carried out consistent with the Article 51 of the UN Charter. So there must first be an armed attack, although the degree of state involvement required is debated. The armed attack must actually be happening or be imminent. And third, the actions taken in self-defense must be necessary and proportionate.
Very complicated issues, again, in terms of insurgencies, terrorist attacks and what have you. How do you define everything?
Absolutely.
When these drones are used in assassinations on enemy-controlled territory, what are their dimensions? Are they the sizes of pizza boxes, or are they the size of fighter jets, basically unmanned fighter jets? What do they look like?
Well, the types of drones, such as the Predator and the Reaper drone that are being flown overseas in Afghanistan and Pakistan and other areas and used to conduct drone strikes, are very large. The Predator, for example, is 27 feet long and has a wingspan of almost 50 feet. The Reaper has a wingspan of almost 66 feet. And the Reaper, for example, can fly at 50,000 feet for up to 34 hours. And it's also equipped with 4 Hellfire missiles and 2 500-pound precision-guided bombs. They're also equipped with radar and other sensors, including infrared and optical camera and advanced target tracking systems.
These military drones, they are operated by, they're in the armed forces, but they're not conventional soldiers who put their lives on the line. They're drone operators. How are they regarded by other people in the armed forces, the US armed forces, do you think?
They've often been regarded as, unfortunately, as wimps or as computer geeks, as not as
gamers, basically.
As gamers, essentially, yes. As not as patriotic, perhaps, as brave and skilled as those who are willing to deploy overseas and risk their lives in face-to-face combat. On the other hand, though, there have been very few accounts and few studies done of drone operators because this is a very new practice. And in fact, though, many of them are based in the U.S. They are waging war from shipping containers in the Nevada desert. It's hard to believe, but there are now more than 1,000 drone operators throughout the United States, largely based in the state of Nevada.
Just outside of Las Vegas, I think there's a big base called the Creech Air Force Base.
Correct. And many of them are, in fact, former Air Force pilots themselves. Some are, as we've said, gamers, young folks who've been recruited. So they essentially sit there in 12-hour shifts working around the clock, and they step into the shipping container and essentially wage war overseas. They're able to, on live color screens, see those who they are killing very, very closely. And that has caused some real stress and trouble for a lot of those individuals.
PTSD and what have you.
PTSD and so forth. And the U.S. military is just now starting to look into this. And in fact, they're deploying psychologists to work with these individuals. And a recent study revealed that, surprisingly, many of these individuals have actually requested to be deployed overseas. They're saying that stress and the difficulty in going home to their families each night, not being able to talk about their experiences each day, essentially stepping into a shipping container and waging war overseas, then going home to the regular world of barbecues and bedtime stories is very difficult for the human psyche to deal with.
I understand there was, for a time, the Pentagon considered creating a Distinguished Warfare Medal for drone operators, but this was abandoned, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And again, that speaks to the culture in many sectors of the military that is unable or unwilling to recognize these individuals as heroes or even as true soldiers in the real sense of the word. It goes against the traditional military ethos in many ways. The fact that one is not called on to put one's own life at risk, and it raises questions about the ethics of one-sided assassinations. Is war just when an individual is not called on to put their own life in harm's way. Now, of course, for thousands of years, military leaders have always looked for ways to reduce the casualties to their own troops. So we can't say that war is unjustified if we're looking to minimize casualties. But there's something that is inherently uncomfortable about the notion of shielding one's personnel thousands and thousands of miles away and essentially engaging in a one-sided campaign of targeted assassinations. It also raises the question of how we would feel if other countries were doing this to us. Would we be okay with that? Is it justified?
Associate Professor Sarah Smythe. Of course, it isn't just the Western military that are embracing drones. In recent times, there has been a growing concern that terror groups are deploying small, widely available consumer drones against their enemies. Oleg Vornik is the CEO of DroneShield, a joint Australian-US-owned company listed on the ASX. Last week, DroneShield informed the ASX that its drone gun product had been acquired by the military of a G7 nation and is currently being tested in Iraq.
Drone gun is a directional drone jammer, which is a safe way of neutralizing consumer and commercial drones. So if you imagine ISIS strapping a couple of 40-millimeter grenades onto a Phantom 4, which is the size of about a soccer ball, and then they fly towards the Western forces or the Iraqi forces, and you want to take it down in a safe way, meaning either send it back where it came from or make it land on the spot, then drone gun is effectively a rifle-shaped jammer. It doesn't fire bullets. It's not a kinetic product, but rather it blocks the connection between the drone and the controller. The drone responds by either coming back to where it came from or landing on the spot.
And do we know, are drones being used by non-state actors, by terrorist groups?
There are certainly quite a lot of media that cover this. In fact, ISIS have themselves reported to have set up a dedicated unit for their forces, which is to do with flying drones in that manner, meaning trapping grenades and other materials onto the drone and then releasing it, creating casualties, and then filming it and uploading on the web. So you're seeing it through their materials, you're seeing it through a number of Western media articles reported, and there's certainly quite a lot of incidents that is going on which are not reported as well. So certainly they're a real thing, especially in the Middle East today.
There were reports some months ago that Neil Prakash, Australia's most wanted terrorist, was involved in developing weaponised drones as a way of fighting advancing enemy troops.
Yes, absolutely. So Neil Prakash is a pretty famous example in Australia, given he's an Australian citizen. However, this is certainly a very large problem, and the problem that we expect only to get worse. At the moment, most of the incidents involve one or two drones with bombs strapped to them. However, same technology can be used to control dozens of drones at the same time with explosives or anthrax or other materials on them and creating havoc. This will not necessarily need to be inside of war zones. ISIS is now putting out videos instructing people on how to do this in the home market, so we expect to see a lot of homegrown terrorism, unfortunately, in this manner shortly as well.
Now, last week, your company, DroneShield, made a statement to the ASX that the drone gun has been sold and is now being trialled by the military of a G7 nation. Is that right?
That's correct. In fact, this has been our second sale of that sort in quite a short amount of time. So this has been a G7 military that is now deploying it in Iraq to combat these kind of situations. And prior to that, a couple of weeks earlier, we had a Middle Eastern military which is aligned with the Western forces that has purchased our equipment on trial basis for exactly the same purpose.
I suppose the danger is, though, that Western forces are using drones every single week to carry out attacks on non-state actors. Is there a danger that those non-state actors will be able to use your product and products like it to prevent attacks by Western military?
That's a very good question. So a couple of things. Firstly, our gun is designed to be used against consumer and commercial drones. So most consumer and commercial drones today utilize the 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz frequencies. So these are the same frequencies that you find in Wi-Fi routers and radios, any publicly available band kind of equipment. And the reason why it's being used is because this is basically how the legislation works in most countries, where there are dedicated bands, for example, for the cell phone, for the public broadcast, etc. And then the bands which are not assigned are being used for electric goods such as drones. Now, military drones use their own dedicated communication channels which are different to those. So we do not believe that our gun will be effective against those. So this is the first comment to make. The second comment to make is that we have fairly strict protocols in terms of who we sell. And this is clearly a full compliance in terms of knowing who your customer is, a list of countries who we would not sell to. So I guess like with any kind of article like what we're selling, there are protocols in place of how you sell it.
Oleg Vornik, the CEO of DroneShield. You're listening to The Law Report on radio or via a podcast, which is available from the RN website and also from iTunes. At iTunes, please do review and rate the program. That helps spread the word to other listeners who might want to get a weekly fix of legal current affairs. Drones also present both enormous opportunities and enormous challenges for police and security forces. Sarah Smythe says right now drones are being used by police in both the USA and Australia for a wide range of tasks.
Essentially, law enforcement officials who were once limited to naked eye surveillance are using them, in fact, to allowing them to see through walls and other solid barriers, to track movements from the sky. They're being used to track drug dealers, assist with hostage standoffs, assessing hazardous materials spills, tracking a weapon tossed by a fleeing suspect, finding the source of fires, and assisting searchers in locating missing persons.
Do you know what the first arrest was that can be attributed to a drone?
The first arrest occurred in the state of North Dakota in 2012 against some individuals who at the time were accused of rustling cattle from a neighboring ranch. The local law enforcement authorities went out to investigate, and for whatever reason, the owners of the land resisted the law enforcement by using shotguns. This led to a 16-hour standoff with law enforcement, and law enforcement became so frustrated that they went to a nearby Air Force base and made an agreement that they would borrow a Predator drone that was not armed at the time, but they used that drone to then conduct surveillance over the property where these individuals had holed themselves up with their guns to see where they were, to allow them to then move in and arrest them physically.
And do we know, has it been used in similar ways since then?
Yes, it has, but they can also be used for high-speed car chases. They're very effective for keeping law enforcement officials out of harm's way.
In terms of these high-speed chases, that also is likely to reduce the danger on other people on the roads.
That's right. They also allow them to see through walls and other solid barriers and track an individual's movements in ways that are no longer limited to naked eye surveillance.
La Trobe University's Associate Professor Sarah Smythe. Drones, of course, don't just present opportunities for law enforcement and security. Drones are used by criminals, for instance, to smuggle contraband into prisons. And also, drone users can either inadvertently or deliberately cause hazards at airports or in flight paths. DroneShield's Oleg Vornik spruiks two products that he says can be deployed in this latest chapter of the internal cat-and-mouse game between crims and law enforcement. One product we've already talked about is the drone gun. The other is a drone detection sensor.
So drone gun was our second product to launch. The first product, which is what we have been selling for several years now, is acoustics-based detection sensors, which notify the user in real time if a drone is approaching. In terms of applications for either of the products, you have the military, which we already discussed, you have the prisons, you have the airports. Any kind of VIP-type customers would be covered by our products. So, for example, we have recently made a sale to the Prime Minister of Turkey, was concerned about this kind of threat. Critical infrastructure is quite important, so think nuclear power stations, electricity transmission grids, etc. Stadia, all of these kind of locations are where our products have a role to play. This year we've been deployed at the Boston Marathon for a third year in a row, working with the Boston Police. However, this said, what we're also finding is that a lot of prisons do not necessarily need to jam a drone. What they often want is to know that drone is incoming, be notified in real time, and then track the drone, see who picks up the package, and then conduct an internal investigation. Necessarily shooting down the drone and doing something with it is less of a priority for them compared to understanding what the plot is, so to speak, inside the prison, who's responsible for dropping the package.
And what are in those packages? I'm assuming telephones, equipment which might be used in an escape.
The most common things are telephones, like you said, escape kits. Drugs are very common, so you can have even the tiniest drone that can fit into a palm of your hand with a little bit of sticky tape attached to it and a few pills onto the sticky tape. So you already have $1,000 worth of contraband on a drone, which is effectively a $50 disposable drone. You don't even need to fly it back from the prison. So prison authorities often find drones like that just lying on the ground. You have razor blades also attached to these drones, so any kind of weapons, so all kinds of things. And drones also used for escape reconnaissance plans as well.
So very clear utility in terms of law enforcement and security. I'm wondering, would you want to sell this product to consumers? Last week we had a program where we talked about some of the safety issues and some of the privacy issues faced by the public. Would you want to be selling this product to the public who might have concerns about people flying over and, taking photos of them as they skinny dip in the privacy of their backyard pool?
Privacy is certainly a key area for us, and we certainly aim to eventually to be selling it into the consumer market. Unlike drone gun, which is a fairly restricted product by nature, so people like you and I cannot have one, drone detection sensors are the ones that we sell, are completely legal for anybody to own, and we believe it's a matter of time before they become more prevalent. So you can have it outside of your window or your balcony. If the drone is hovering outside trying to take pictures or a video of you, then you have ability to close the curtains or perhaps have an integrated system of the blinds shutting when the drone is outside the window, ensuring your privacy.
Again, same with the double-edged sword we were talking about with non-state actors or terrorist groups. This means that if you've got your marijuana plantation in the bush or you've got some other kind of nefarious enterprise, this would be a useful tool as well as a tool for law enforcement and security. It'll work both ways.
It certainly does, and this comes back to your selling protocols. So we're very mindful as to who we sell the system to. We have strict compliance protocols in place. This is both for drone gun and also for the drone detection sensors. We try to understand who the product goes to. Most of our sales today are done through our global distributor network. So we have over 100 distributors in approximately 50 countries. Each distributor is generally very well across of their local market. They know identity of the customers they're dealing with. And so we would generally seek to ensure that when we sell our sensors, it ends up in good hands. But like you said, of course, two-edged sword with a lot of these kind of technologies.
Oleg Vornik, the CEO of DroneShield, a joint Australian-US company with offices in both Virginia and Sydney. Yes, a two-edged sword of new technology, drones, drone guns and drone detection sensors. That's the Law Report for this week. A big thanks to producer Anita Barrow and also to technical producer this week, Kieran Ruffles. I'm Damien Carrick. Talk to you next week with more law.